Pues quería agradecer a Alberto la invitación de participar en esta reunión y también de mostrar mi admiración respecto a la gran energía que tiene Alberto en armar ese tipo de encuentro. For those of you who are students of Alberto's here, you've been with him, you've worked with him, but you haven't really seen, many of you will not have seen the field yet, and you won't be able to fully appreciate what you have here until you leave. But know that what you see here is not typical. So I hope that you get a chance to really take full advantage of the kind of, not precociousness, but the enthusiasm and the energy with which Alberto engages with new topics. And in a way that, in my experience, is completely unparalleled in our field. So, mi título es The Desencuentros of History, Indianismo and Marxism in Bolivia, y es una primera aproximación, un intento de reflexionar y de pensar sobre el tema de desencuentro en la Potencia plebeya de García Linera. Desencuentro aparece en uno de los últimos, las últimas partes del libro, pero me parece que es un tema corriente por todos lados del libro y que aparece en distintas maneras en varias partes. Así que es un intento de rescatar la importancia del tema de desencuentro en términos de la reflexión sobre las relaciones y las no relaciones entre, por ejemplo, movimientos campesinales, indígenas por un lado, y marxismo y nacionalismo popular por otro lado. In an essay entitled Indianismo y Marxismo, el desencuentro entre dos razones revolucionarias, originally published in Revista Bonataria in 2005, and later republished in La Potencia plebeya in 2008, Álvaro García Linera takes up the theme of a repeated desencuentro, a failure of understanding or a missed encounter between emancipatory projects in Bolivian history. While the title of his essay identifies these competing trends under two unifying headings, Marxismo e Indianismo, one could easily construct a slightly different formulation of this pattern in terms of a series of disagreements between indigenous struggles for decolonization or autonomy on the one hand, and various urban-centered modernizing and developmentalist projects of the left, including anarcho-syndicalism, Marxism, and the National Popular Revolution of 1952, which, in spite of their ideological differences, all approached industrialization and proletariat struggle as the only path toward meaningful social transformation. And in fact, in some of the earlier essays in La Potencia plebeya, including chapters 4, Movimiento Obrero, and chapter 5, Movimiento Indígena, do precisely that. Or, if we wanted to push things in a slightly different direction, we could say that the structure of desencuentro is repeated in the crossing between theories of political radicalism that are overtly borrowed from European contexts, European social and intellectual histories on the one hand, and emancipatory movements directed by and claiming to receive their conceptual grounding from indigenous Andean traditions on the other hand. However we choose to characterize these competing trajectories and tendencies that do not meet, or that cannot agree on what is at stake, what defines the missed encounter as such, it seems to me, is an unthought fault line that runs between the categories of class and ethnicity, or ethnicity and culture. As Oscar pointed out, that it's not just about ethnicity, it's about ethnicity and the practices associated with it, and which has tended to pose significant difficulties for various efforts to articulate either popular social categories as part of a larger chain of equivalences, or to separate those categories once and for all, and to see them as distinct categories that have nothing in common. In the first part of this paper, I propose to show, albeit in a limited and very modest form of somebody who makes no claim to being a Bolivianist, how the tracing of this history of desencuentros might be extended back to the threshold of independence and the formation of the Bolivian Republic. The point of such an exercise, which I can only allude to in very schematic fashion here, would be to develop a better and deeper understanding of how it is that the Republican state in Bolivia has always been a colonial state, regardless of whether its authority is consolidated through domination, brute force, hegemony, or a mixture thereof. At the same time, Bolivian history could provide the terrain for exploring in greater depth what appears to be an uncanny logical identity between hegemony and coloniality. More on that to come. In the second part of the paper, I look at several important points of contention within Bolivian and Latin American, within the Bolivian and Latin American left, in the wake of what the historian Adolfo Gili has called the first revolution of the 21st century, that is, the popular uprisings of 2000 and 2003 against the neoliberal privatization of natural resources, water and gas, that led to the forced resignation of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada and the election of Evo Morales in 2006. García Linera's Indianismo y Marxismo essay provides a sustained and withering internal critique of the reception of Marxist thought in Bolivia, starting with the aftermath of the Chaco War, leading up to the imposition of neoliberal reform in the 1980s. As is the case in many other Latin American contexts, the dominant reception of Marxism in Bolivia, according to García Linera, relied on an overly literal understanding of the analyses of English, French, and German histories in Marx's writings, dogmatically transforming what Marx's observations and prognoses regarding those histories into rigid ontogenetic templates that must be followed in all other regional histories, culminating in several theoretically problematic and politically self-limiting conclusions. These overly literal readings of Marx were based in part, García Linera suggests, on the relative inaccessibility of texts such as Marx's correspondence with the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich and the ethnographic studies of the non-European contexts in works such as the Kovalevsky Notebook. The problems identified by García Linera are interrelated and seem to presuppose one another. The first involves the equation of Marxian historicism with a strategic and deterministic philosophy of history. The second problem is that industrialization and the proletariat are construed as the only possible road to emancipatory social transformation. As a result, Bolivian Marxism tended to internalize the factory's technical rationality of specialization, the real subsumption of labor, and capitalism's abstractions, the abstraction of time, the abstraction that is valuation, while losing sight of the historicity of those phenomena. The third problem is that Bolivian Marxism displayed a fundamental incomprehension toward the realities of campesinos and indios, who together appeared to Marxism as what García Linera calls un bloqueo cognitivo y una imposibilidad epistemológica. With very few exceptions, Bolivian Marxism of the 20th century regarded the traditional or non-liberal social practices of indigenous communities as backward relics of an archaic past that would need to be modernized and homogenized, presumably as something resembling the disciplined proletariat culture of the working class, before the indigenous could be considered a social and political subject capable of making its own history. In the aftermath of the post-1952 breakup of the large latifundios and the redistribution of land to peasants in the Altiplano, Bolivian Marxism reactively defined this new landowning class as pequeños burgueses, and thereby missed an opportunity to bring to light the technical rationale at work in the Bolivian agrarian economy. For instance, the distinction between formal and real subsumption of labor in the countryside. In place of indio and campesino, then, Bolivian Marxism could only see a nascent obrero waiting to be brought forth. Para este marxismo no había ni indios ni comunidad, García Linera concludes, con lo que una de las más ricas vetas del pensamiento marxista clásico queda bloqueada y rechazada como herramienta interpretativa de la realidad boliviana. This theoretical missed encounter would in turn prompt Bolivian indigenous movements later on in the 20th century to conceive of their own movement or movements as opposed to Marxism, or at least as opposed to the dominant understanding of that traditional thought. But while Linera highlights the theoretical deficiencies and possible ethical failures on the part of Marx's readers in Bolivia, it may be that the structure of desencuentro extends beyond these personal and shared epistemological shortcomings. In a certain sense, Bolivian history is not just troubled by desencuentros. It is this history of desencuentros. of misunderstandings and failures to form alliances that is enacted in different ways over time. It is the history of what is not properly historicizable, the narrativation of what cannot be narrated because it can only take place as a non-relation or as a missed encounter. Let me offer an analogy to try to clarify the point. The Bolivian thinker René Zavaleta, who Oscar referred to as well, whose later thought undoubtedly qualifies as one of the few exceptions to which I just alluded, developed a notion of formación social abigarrada to describe the socially and culturally heterogeneous tapestry that is Bolivian social reality. Whereas abigarrada would ordinarily imply a negative aesthetic or epistemological judgment, for example, colors that clash, or a jumbled, disjointed mixture of elements that does not add up to a coherent unity or make a one, Zavaleta's idiosyncratic use of the term sought to acknowledge and think heterogeneity as reality rather than as residual deficiency that could be corrected through the proper application of developmentalist formulas. Formación social abigarrada thus emerges as part of a self-critical reevaluation of Bolivian Marxism from within. If abigarramiento is a spatial metaphor that seeks to acknowledge heterogeneity and internal contradiction as such, desencuentro might provide a temporal metaphor that attempts to think the disjunctive simultaneity of what are ordinarily assumed to be incompatible historical temporalities in Bolivia. As Sinclair Thompson notes in Revolutionary Horizons, Past and Present in Bolivian Politics, Bolivian historiography has tended to organize Republican history around three central revolutionary nodes, or moments. The first instance, which in fact belongs to the prehistory of the Republic, is found in the Andean indigenous uprisings of 1780-81 that began in Cusco under Tupac Amaru II, a descendant of Incan royalty, and then spread to the area around El Alto, where an indigenous commoner named Tupac Katari led an Aymara and Quechua insurrection that liberated the surrounding countryside from colonial control. Katari's indigenous armies soon arrived at the walls of La Paz, and although they laid siege to the city for 5 months, they were unable to muster support from urban Creoles and mestizos, and were finally defeated by Spanish counterinsurgency forces sent from Buenos Aires in late 1781. As Thompson points out, recent Aymara-led protests that have culminated in popular marches on La Paz and its civic and political institutions in September 2000 to protest the privatization of water, in October 2003 and June 2005 to protest the privatization of natural gas, will be interpreted by both popular participants and by the anti-popular elites as returns of the promise or of the specter of the 1780-81 Indianist uprisings. By the same token, one might surmise that the non-response in 1781 on the part of urban mestizo and Creole elites, who would only several decades later organize their own revolt against Spanish colonial forces, resonates again in the attitude of modern Bolivian elites, whether in the form of racialized denigration of indios or in the theoretical tendency to disregard ethnicity as an epiphenomenon of class. The second nodal point in Thompson's schema is the National Popular Revolution of 1952, sparked by militant factory workers and miners under the leadership of the Movimiento Revolucionario Nacionalista. The 1952 popular revolt overthrew a long-standing seigneurial oligarchic regime while bringing about social reforms including universal suffrage, universal education, land reform, driven by the breakup of latifundios in the Altiplano, nationalization of tin mines, and the formation of the Centro Obrero Boliviano, which soon established itself as one of the most militant labor organizations in all of Latin America. As Garcia Linera notes, the 1952 revolution illustrates an important distinction between the reception of Marx in mid-20th century Bolivia and Bolivian nationalism. While the two political tendencies shared the same view of industrialization as the only legitimate path to progress, nationalism possessed a political will to power, whereas the mid-19th century Marxist thought was by and large satisfied with reproducing textbook accounts of what had to take place in order to generate the conditions of possibility for overcoming capitalism. While the official discourse of the National Popular Revolution showed little interest in exploring questions of indigeneity above and beyond the assimilationist reforms that I just mentioned, the fact that it offered the promise of full citizenship and social mobility while reducing or eliminating many structures of domination and exploitation meant that the national popular imaginary became fixed as a new epical horizon for the entirety of Bolivian society, including indigenous communities, up until the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s, and regardless of the fact that democracy's continuity was truncated by a series of military interventions in the 1960s and 70s. The National Popular Revolution retains its ideological hegemony until 1986, when the Paz Estensoro administration, under the economic tutelage of Harvard economist Jeffrey Sachs and Bolivian Minister of Economy Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, implemented neoliberal reforms that included privatizing the nation's most productive tin mines and laying off or relocating thousands of miners. In his essay on La muerte de la condición obrera en el siglo XX, La marcha minera por la vida, García Linera describes the ensuing confrontation between relocated miners and the Bolivian state as another kind of desencuentro, this time not between two parts of the left, but between the left and the state. This time it's not a missed encounter between parallel emancipatory struggles, but rather a scene structured by radically asymmetrical powers of visibility. True to their working class tradition, the displaced miners met in Oruro and Potosí to organize a protest march on La Paz, where they fully expected the state to meet them and to negotiate a new agreement, as it always had in the past. If the Bolivian mining syndicate was regarded as the most militant labor movement in Latin America, it nonetheless had tied itself to a structure of negotiated pacts whose inevitable outcome included reconfirming the sovereign authority of the state. What actually happens in 1986, however, is something for which the working class history of the Centro Obrero Boliviano offered no precedent or model. Paz Estensoro responded to the miners' Marcha de la Vida by declaring a state of siege, once again, perhaps an echo of 1781, and sending low-flying fighter jets over the endless lines of marching miners. Faced with this unanticipated threat of annihilation, the miners returned to Oruro with their demands unmet. This retreat, which allowed no space for working-class heroism or martyrdom, signals what García Linera calls the end of the proletariat as a conceptual category and political signifier in 20th century Bolivia. The third revolutionary node is found in the popular uprisings that began as protests against neoliberal privatization of water in 2000 and natural gas in 2003 and 2005, and then quickly escalated into a widespread movement against the neoliberal state, culminating in the resignation of Sanchez de Lozada in 2003 and the election of Evo Morales and García Linera in 2006. The anti-neoliberal movement also drew on cocalero protests against Bolivia's participation in the US-led eradication of coca under Plan Colombia, as well as a broader Aymara-led movement seeking fuller participation of indigenous communities in the national affairs, for whom popular opposition to privatizing natural resources in the early 2000s easily resonated with indianista notions of ecological ethos of buen vivir. But while the events of Cochabamba and La Paz appear to have provided the sparks that suddenly precipitated the unexpected collapse of the neoliberal state in 2005, in the Indianismo y Marxismo essay, García Linera documents a longer trajectory of intellectual and activist work associated with Fausto Reinega and the Catarista movement, which over the course of several decades had laid groundwork for the revitalization of contestatory politics and challenges to state sovereignty in the early 2000s, following nearly 2 decades of neoliberal consensus. García Linera credits Catarismo with the reinvention of Indianitud as a category now divested of its former stigma and transformed into a signifier of social and political subjectivization. Catarismo brings about an Indianista renaissance, a reclaiming and reinvention of Indian histories and pasts, cultural practices, travails and virtues, all of which generate a symbolic archive from which new forms of political awareness and collective organization can draw their inspiration. By way of conclusion, and at the risk of producing my own abigarramiento of themes and contexts, I want to look briefly at how 2 ideological tendencies I've been discussing in García Linera's work, indianismo and marxismo, map onto the landscape of post-2006 Bolivia. And I have more questions than answers, but I'll pose this in the form of a proposal or proposition. For the sake of convenience, let me take 2 influential truth claims that today seek to establish their own account of what is happening in Bolivia and of which way the wind might be blowing today. The first is what Garcia Linera describes as the communist horizon of the present, or what Bruno Bastos calls a communism of communisms that would presumably possess the capacity to incorporate both Marxist and Indianist emancipatory projects under the same hegemonic conceptual umbrella, without compelling either one to subjugate or renounce its own rationality. The second claim is decolonial discourse. Prospects for decolonial theory would seem to be bolstered today by the evident fact that in post-neoliberal times, Bolivia has experienced far more tangible success in decolonizing the state than in moving toward an anti-capitalist or post-capitalist form of social organization. But while the forging of a new, more culturally diverse and democratic form of republicanism under the plurinational state is certainly to be welcomed, I'm not certain whether decolonial theory itself would be capable of thinking beyond the colonial structures of power that constitute the main objects of its critiques. I say this because decolonial theory remains dependent on a culturalism in the last instance that may be constitutively incapable of distancing itself from the logic of coloniality. So in other words, decolonial thought doesn't think the limit of culture, which I would say is, in turn, constitutes its own limitation as far as its political and epistemological impact goes. In an essay entitled Monolingualism of the Other, or Prosthesis of the Origin, Jacques Derrida explores the hypothesis that, I quote, "I have only one language and yet it is not mine." If I have only one language, it's because, as is the case with the law, I first come to language as something that has imposed itself unilaterally on me from elsewhere, as proscription, injunction, appeal, hailing, and so on. I come to it, or it comes to me, as a cut in the real, a primordial signifier in relation to which all of my symbolizations, articulations, and forgettings will be organized subsequently. Language and law are ostensibly experienced as part of an autonomous I. As the fluent speaker of a language, or as member of a community, it must be it must be as if I give the law to myself. I can't experience the law as imposed on me from outside. And yet the origins of the law's authority remain shrouded in a certain opacity that coincides with the law's absolute heteronomy vis-a-vis the responsible subject. If the monolanguage that I speak is not mine, meanwhile, this is in part because I'm not the master of language, but rather the opposite. Even as I tell myself that I use language to do this or that, or to get what I want, the truth is that language speaks through me. It speaks through me. But it's also not mine because language can never be one, neither self-contained nor self-identical. All language remains dependent on its contiguity with other languages, just as the sense of any signifier depends on its proximity and its difference vis-a-vis other signifiers. By the same token, the resources of a given language are necessarily dependent on material elements, marks, spacings, contiguities, etc., that are irreducible to the economies of valuation or signification in which they participate. Language thus embodies the prosthesis of origin, the originary supplement of techniques to which the human must turn in order to realize its own being. The essence of human culture, if there is one, is an essential split between that which possesses its own principle of change and action within, and that which is compelled to turn outside of itself, even before it's possible to speak of itself. The French archaeologist André Leroy-Gourhan developed the notion of exteriorization to describe how the human use of techniques has the effect of expanding the boundaries of its own body by incorporating what is outside of itself, and more often than not, dead matter, inert matter as opposed to flesh and blood, into the fold of human being, of human acting. But as Bernard Stiegler notes, exteriorization contains a paradox that is analogous to what Derrida calls the prosthesis of origin. In Stiegler's words, and I quote, "The paradox is to have to speak of an exteriorization without a preceding interior. The interior, what is properly human in phylogenetic terms, or the self in psychological terms, is constituted in and through exteriorization." In contrast to this thought of the prosthesis of origin, or originary exteriorization, Derrida asserts that the concept of culture is essentially colonial in origin. In addition to the common etymology of the two terms, colere, to tend, to guard, to cultivate, and to inhabit, modern conceptualizations of culture invariably entail one or another form of naming and policing the distinction between the proper and the improper, between what's proper to culture and what's improper to culture, between us and them. There could be no concept of culture without the presupposition of a community and a language that are one, distinguishable in the last instance from all others and identical to itself. In its self-institution, culture invariably imposes police measures that equate origin with identity and mastery, while seeking to arbitrate who's authorized to speak about such and such a topic versus who must be content to listen and learn because she or he is not from here or has not lived here long enough. As Derrida puts it, the, I quote, monolingualism imposed by the other operates by relying on a sovereignty whose essence is always colonial and which tends repressively and irrepressibly to reduce language to the one, that is, to the hegemony of the homogeneous. End of quote. But as we've just seen, there is no belonging, or rather the belonging is the homo-hegemonic fiction that ensues from and seeks to cover up the impurity of exteriorization. It seems to me that neither the decolonial approach to epistemological and ontological difference, the difference between the mono-ontology of Europe and the relational ontology of indigenous communities, neither that nor the notion of a communist hegemony or a communism of communisms would be able to think the gap that separates and joins Bolivian history as the narrativation of what resists narrative, or as desencuentro. While the prospects for a decolonial position seem to have been brightened by the Constituent Assembly and by the plurinational state, decolonial discourse depends and remains dependent on the key distinction between Western epistemology and ontology, which, as it reminds us, is grounded in the reductive violence of dualisms, culture and nature, us and them, civilization and barbarism, and pueblo originario traditions that remain more open to fluid ways of thinking about and practicing relationality. Whether the distinction as posed by decolonial thought could actually hold up to serious scrutiny or not, and whether or not decolonial thought is itself reproducing the dualist structure at a different level, regardless of that question, it seems to me that what's clear is that its framing mechanism does not allow it to break away fully from the colonial problem of homo-hegemony just described. Both decolonial discourse and the notion of the communist horizon may serve precisely to avoid the structure of desencuentro and abigarramiento, together with the contradictions and the disagreements that these terms imply. By contrast, I would propose that the emergence of emancipatory projects in Bolivian history would seem to derive as much, if not more, from the latter, from mixture, contamination, and the risks of tenuous communication, as well as misunderstanding, than from the purity and hegemony of the former.